I'm a bit nervous for this one, I'm not going to lie. I've got some relatively big news to share with you, news that will probably change the course of my life from here on in, and will also change the style of videos I make on YouTube. But since you guys have been so involved in my journey throughout and have been extremely supportive, I feel I owe it to you guys to actually share this news with you, but also share my thinking and my context and the context behind the decisions I make. So I don't think I'll be able to cover everything in a single video. So I'm going to make a series of videos essentially outlining everything that's happened so far, my experiences, the process, and also my decision. Yeah, I'm hoping that you guys will be in support of that decision, and that you'll be thrilled for me as I am quite happy with the decision that I've made. So, to become a surgeon in the United Kingdom, you need to apply to core surgical training, which is one of the many bottlenecks that exist. There are around a couple of hundred jobs in the UK, of which around 40 to 50 are in London. If you want the competitive specialties, there's only a couple. So, for example, if you wanted plastics themed job or a plastics heavy job, there's only a couple in London, I think around 4 or 5. Same being true for ear, nose, and throat, the same being true for cardiothoracics or any of the more competitive specialties. Now, at this point, I had been exposed to orthopedic surgery, general surgery, a lot of general surgery, neurosurgery, and cardiothoracic surgery, and a couple of other surgeries. And I'd had a taster week in ear, nose, and throat, and it was a very niche specialty, and it also seemed quite representative between the two sexes. And most trainees, like I said, were quite happy with it, and that's always a sign of a good specialty to pursue. And the operating was incredible. Like, some of the stuff you just have zero exposure to, like lateral skull base, anterior skull base, or otology, you just don't know or don't hear anything about during medical school. So it's something that intrigues me. But with it being a very good specialty, it was very competitive to get in. So most people applied to surgical training during their second foundation year training. I was a bit unsure about what I wanted to do and whether I wanted to do an ENT themed job or a general surgical job or take some time out altogether. So as a result, I ended up taking a year out, an F3 year, which was disrupted by COVID. But in that time, I actually did a couple of taster weeks within ear, nose, and throat. I went to the Royal National Throat, Nose, and Ear Hospital in King's Cross, the Grey Inns Road, the mecca of ENT around the world. Most of the finest surgeons have actually come out of that hospital. And when I was there, I got to meet a number of fantastic surgeons who both gave me guidance regarding future pursuits, a career in ENT, as well as also some real life advice, which I'll share in a future video. Within core surgical training, you have 2 years to meet the competence to apply for a higher surgical program. So if you want to do general surgery, it's advisable that you do a lot of general surgery so you can meet your numbers for laparoscopic procedures or emergency laparotomies, and also increase your knowledge base so you do well at the ST3 interviews. In the same way, if you want to do ear, nose, and throat, it's advisable that you do not only ear, nose, and throat rotations, but also some allied specialties, which will again boost your numbers and boost your clinical acumen so you perform better at interview, as well as through the portfolio. So if I wanted a career in ENT, it was almost essential that I had an ENT themed core surgical training position for 2 years. As a result, I applied to core surgical training and was very lucky to secure one of the most competitive jobs available. I got ENT themed job within London, and I've announced this on a previous video, but the jobs that I took were ENT for 4 months, pediatric surgery for 4 months, ENT for 4 months, 6 months of maxillofacial surgery, and a further 6 months of ENT. So on the whole, I would do very well on the portfolio aspect of things because I had a good balance between allied specialties and ENT, and I would also have the chance to try out ENT for the very first time, to actually operate and to be an ENT trainee at a junior level, but nonetheless an ENT trainee. My first rotation was in the northwest of London in a very, very busy centre which had a good balance of all the different specialties within ENT, within pediatrics, within airway, within otology, within rhinology, within head and neck cancer. And as a junior trainee, you got exposed to a lot of them. And the emergency department yielded all sorts of wonders of emergencies and different sort of clinical presentations. And I absolutely loved ENT at that point. So by the end of the first rotation, I was pretty sure I wanted to do ENT. As a result, the next step for me was to actually sit the second part of my surgical exams. Now, if you're going to go down a general surgical route, you're required to sit Part B of the membership of the Royal College of Surgeons. However, if you choose to do ENT, you have the option, or rather the requirement, to do the DONS OSCE. So it's the equivalent of MRCS Part B, but rather it's for those who want a career in ENT. Now, there are some ENT trainees that will actually do both, so they're dual qualified almost, even though it's not a qualification. Essentially, you just get an extra couple of letters on your name, so you will be XY MBBS, or whatever your medical degree is, MRCS DOHNS DONS, MRCS DONS, rather than MRCS ENT, which on a day-to-day basis has no implications. Now, for me, the trade-off of all this time and revision and money for 4 letters on the end of my name wasn't it. So I just chose to do the DONS OSCE, which was a dual exam. So you had to sit paper as well as perform the OSCE, and it was done during COVID times, so certain things were a little bit different from how they used to be. There was a no-touch technique, so some of the examinations that we would usually perform on our patients in the OSCE were actually removed from the exam, which made it more difficult because you couldn't prepare. Because previously you could expect a thyroid exam, you could expect a flexible nasal endoscopy, but during this sort of adapted COVID time, you had no idea what was going to come up. So it did make the exam difficult in preparation. But anyway, I sat the exam and alhamdulillah, I passed the exam and I moved on. And this I sat during the allied specialty proportion of my trainings when I was doing paediatric surgery at Great Ormond Street Hospital. Again, I was exposed to children, paediatric surgery, orthopedic surgery, and a whole host of very specialist operations that were absolutely fantastic to experience for the first time. I also sort of reassured me that ENT was actually it for me, because paediatric surgery was wonderful, and ENT surgery, within ENT surgery, you operate on a lot of children. However, you don't get the complexity, or the general ENT surgeon doesn't get the complexity that is involved in caring for neonates who need life-saving operations. But yeah, so I left that rotation having passed the exam and also had a good feel of what it's like to actually care for children from a surgical trainee perspective. And I absolutely loved it. I had an incredible time at Great Ormond Street. It's always been one of my dreams to actually work in that hospital. I've actually got a book called Children First and Always. Hang on, this is one of the first books I ever bought for myself, and I actually referenced it in my personal statement all those years back. This book was published in 1986, and till this day, I reference it. Whenever I have a free minute, I will read some of these stories about these kids. It's actually absolutely incredible place. So I then left Great Ormond Street Hospital and I went east. I went to the Royal London Hospital, which was a major trauma centre. It has a helicopter. We've got major trauma coming in, neck stabbings, shootings, all sorts would come in. And within ENT, you actually get exposed to all this exciting emergency work, as the neck is a very vulnerable part. During trauma, during stabbings and shootings, you inevitably will get some patients come in with this sort of injury. And it also highlighted the acute side of ENT as well, that depending on where you work and your skill set, you may be exposed to some very critical problems within the neck and the airway. So at this point, I was almost relatively certain that I wanted to do ENT for the rest of my life. And the realities of the next bottleneck were looming over me, the ST3 interviews. Now, this is the greatest bottleneck of any surgical career, because this is the point at which there's the most resistance. There's probably a couple hundred ENT SHOs or ENT wannabe trainees. I don't know what the right term is, but people who aspire to do ENT for a higher surgical specialty. And every year they announce a very small number of jobs, and there's always a lot of people left without a job. So most years there's only around 20 to 40 jobs announced nationally, and that number varies dramatically based on how many people leave the program, i.e. qualify, become a consultant, how many people go away to do fellowships, how many people go away to do PhDs, how many people take time off in sickness or for maternity or paternity leave, or many other reasons essentially. And every year that number gets reshuffled and a small number of jobs are announced. And the competition that you have stiffens every single year because you have the bottleneck of being a doctor, then foundation training, then core surgical training, and then specialty training. So this is really, one of the greatest bottlenecks there. And it's really quite a stressful time to go through. And I remember when I was in that final rotation, I was doing everything that was in my power to maximize my portfolio. I was doing publications, audits, research, presented at a couple of conferences, speaking to a couple of people to try and get my portfolio as strong as it possibly could so it can stand the difficulty of ST3 or registrar interviews. And so I left my third rotation of core surgical training with a relatively okay-ish portfolio. I certainly was nowhere near the top, 25% of those applying, but I had a relatively good chance. I think I'd secured enough points to actually get an interview. And then I left that rotation and I had submitted my portfolio for consideration of an interview, and then the waiting game begins. And again, because of COVID, the traditional way that people get interviewed for registrar training was completely changed. Previously, it was 5 stations or so, of which there was a clinical skill station where they watched you operate or they watched you simulate an operation. There was a motivation station, there was a portfolio station, and there was a variety of different stations that wouldn't be possible during this COVID or post-COVID era. So we were still waiting to hear what the interviews were going to look like this year and how they were going to take place. And during that time, as I was waiting, I moved on to my first rotation of core surgical training year 2. I moved on to maxillofacial surgery, which was by far the most interesting allied specialty I'd come across. The scope of practice was incredible, and in a different life, I could very easily see myself being a maxillofacial surgeon. However, I had already committed to ENT, and also maxillofacial surgery had a number of obstacles that didn't make sense in my head. The main one being you had to go back to dentistry. You had to go to dental school. They are now running some abbreviated dental degrees where you can qualify within 3 years. But the idea of going back to university to do dentistry, I just couldn't. I couldn't get myself to do it. You'd be 3 years behind your counterparts, at least £27,000 in debt, and I just couldn't reconcile it. And I will make another video detailing exactly why I can do maxillofacial surgery, but it just wasn't it for me. And at this point, I was pretty convinced that ENT actually was more exciting than maxillofacial surgery. There was a certain number of surgical fields within ENT that couldn't be replicated or, replaced by maxillofacial surgery, especially otology, which is a whole field that, is so protected and no one knows anything about it. I still don't know much about otology, despite being in that sort of field for around 2 years now. I put the application through. I was going to be applying for ENT registrar training, and now all I had to do was sit back and wait to see what happens next. All right, I think this is probably a good time to end the first video, and in the next video I guess we'll recap what happens next. I'll talk a little bit about my interview. Yeah, thank you very much for watching. If there's anything you want me to cover in my next video or in the videos thereafter, let me know in the comments below. I will be eagerly reading your comments, and I'm sorry to end on a cliffhanger, but I know people's attention span isn't of 30+ minutes, so it's probably best that I end it and I start a new video. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you very soon.